The 11 Invisible Traps of False Light. If you feel more anxiety than peace, more judgment than compassion, and more isolation than connection, pay attention. Spirituality, which was supposed to be your light, may be trapping you in the most subtle prison there is. And the most dangerous thing? You don't even realize it. Imagine that your search for light is actually leading you to darkness. That the path to inner peace can, without you realizing it, become a prison. In this video, we'll delve into the subtler corners of the spiritual journey. Not to criticize, but to illuminate the invisible pitfalls that can mislead even the most dedicated seeker. We'll explore what toxic spirituality, reveal the difference between authentic and illusory faith, and unravel the warning signs that most of us ignore. You will discover how exaggerated positivity becomes a mask, how ego can disguise itself as enlightened, and why comparison is a silent poison. Let's learn together to distinguish discipline from addiction and dependence from true support. Prepare yourself for a reflection that could change your outlook on personal growth. Because true evolution begins when we have the courage to look at our own shadow. Take a deep breath and come with me. What is toxic spirituality? Toxic spirituality is a paradoxical phenomenon. It arises when the search for evolution and inner peace, one of the noblest human aspirations, deviates from its original path and becomes a labyrinth of self-delusion and imprisonment. Far from being a path to liberation, it builds invisible prisons made of rigid dogmas, unfounded comparisons, and a growing disconnect from reality. Often this detour stems from genuine intention. The seeker, thirsting for answers to suffering and a greater meaning in life, finds in spirituality a promise of refuge. However, instead of becoming a beacon of self-knowledge, this search becomes a form of escape. The practitioner believes they are on a continuous ascension, but in reality, they are merely distancing themselves from themselves, their unresolved pain, and the challenges of the real world. This trap is so subtle that it can affect both beginners, desperately seeking a magic solution, and experienced individuals who have already walked the path for many years. Toxic spirituality is characterized by a practice that, instead of generating expansion and fluidity, creates a vicious cycle of limiting beliefs. It's like trying to heal a serious wound with a plastic bandage. The pain isn't resolved, only masked, and the underlying problem worsens over time. The individual feels safe and protected within their bubble of beliefs, but this security is a false sense of evolution. They are in a room lit by artificial light that blocks the view of the sun outside. Many fall prey to toxic spirituality because they seek shortcuts. The promise of instant healing, immediate awakening, or a permanent state of enlightenment seems appealing in a world filled with anxiety and suffering. However, this expectation creates emotional dependence, whether on ritualistic practices, substances, masters, or groups. The person becomes a perpetual patient, waiting for something or someone outside to save them. The result is stagnation disguised as progress. It's the illusion of a light that doesn't truly illuminate, as it comes not from within but from an external source. Another important aspect is its seduction. Toxic spirituality offers the feeling of belonging to a select group of chosen ones and, with it, an illusory sense of superiority. It constructs a spiritual identity that doesn't dissolve the ego, but rather feeds it in subtle and dangerous ways. The individual begins to believe they are special, more evolved, or enlightened, losing humility, their sense of humanity, and the ability to learn. This is one of the greatest dangers of deviation. The path that should lead to union with the whole becomes a platform for the ego. Toxic spirituality doesn't arise from a single mistake, but from the accumulation of small distortions. Every choice based on escaping reality, denying pain, or seeking shortcuts reinforces this pattern. It's a belief system that ultimately serves to keep the individual comfortable and safe. far from their vulnerabilities. The true spiritual path, on the contrary, promotes expansion, freedom, and authenticity, inviting the person to face their fears, integrate their shadows, and live fully with all their complexities. The greatest danger lies in the fact that those who experience toxic spirituality often don't realize it. Because their belief in their own growth is so strong, they ignore signs of stagnation, such as the repetition of emotional patterns and a lack of real transformation in their daily lives. This can lead to deep frustration in the long run, and, even worse, drive others away from the spiritual path by confusing faith with illusion. The confusion becomes a collective blockage. It's crucial to understand that toxic spirituality doesn't mean abandoning spirituality. On the contrary, it's an invitation to vigilance and discernment. Self-knowledge should be the foundation of all spiritual practice. Without it, one risks building a sandcastle that crumbles at the slightest sign of a storm. The true foundation needs to be solid, built on truth and authenticity. This concept shows us that not every spiritual practice is healthy. There's a fine line between discipline and imprisonment. When practice becomes a burden, a reason to feel superior, or a way to avoid reality, it loses its purpose. Spirituality is movement, transformation, and integration. Everything that imprisons distances us from our essence. Recognizing toxic spirituality requires courage, the honesty to look within and admit when light has turned to shadow. Transformation begins when truth is embraced. If this clarity has given you room to breathe, consider walking nearby. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each new encounter comes as a gentle reminder that maturity is the light that embraces clouds and chooses possible paths. We continue together, fine-tuning our presence without denying the humanness that we are. Is the spirituality you practice a path to liberation or a prison disguised as light? Does it connect you to the real world or isolate you from it? A difference between authentic and illusory spirituality. Authentic and illusory spirituality are like two sides of the same coin, but with completely different values. Authentic, it embraces the totality of human experience, integrating light and shadow. It doesn't promise shortcuts, but rather values the daily process of construction. Each step is taken consciously, and true authenticity lies in the balance between practice and real life, between meditation and facing a problem at work, between prayer and empathy in everyday life. And illusory spirituality, it is sustained by appearances. It manifests itself in ready-made phrases, mechanical rituals, and promises of miraculous cures. Instead of bringing genuine transformation, it generates a dangerous self-deception. The practitioner believes they are constantly advancing, but in reality, they are running in circles. It's like a boat rocking with the waves, but never reaching its destination, because its sails are only geared towards appearances, not the real wind. Signs of distinction. Humility versus spiritual pride. Authentic spirituality has humility as its pillar. Those who follow it know that evolution is a continuous process and that there is no finish line. The true seeker recognizes that everyone is on the path, each at their own pace, and does not place themselves on a pedestal. On the other hand, illusory spirituality fuels the feeling of being more enlightened, generating spiritual pride, competition, and the separation between us and them. Freedom versus rigidity. Authentic spirituality promotes freedom. It sees each practice, each symbol, and each teacher as a temporary tool, not a prison. The practitioner feels free to adapt their path, question their beliefs, and explore new perspectives. Illusory spirituality, on the other hand, clings to fixed formulas and rigid dogmas, believing that only one path, one teacher, or one group holds absolute truth. This rigidity blocks the expansion of consciousness and creativity. Impact on practical life. Authenticity is revealed in everyday life. A truly spiritual person reflects their practices in their relationships, their choices, how they deal with difficulties, and their responsibility to the world. Illusory spirituality, however, is restricted to isolated moments, a weekend ritual, a 10-minute meditation, or reading a book. It's like lighting a candle in the temple but living in darkness outside. True evolution is measured in real life, not in performance. Shadow integration. Authentic spirituality understands that the shadow, difficult emotions, fears, and failures, should not be denied, but rather integrated. It recognizes that there is no light without darkness, and that healing comes from balance. Illusory spirituality, on the other hand, creates a rose-colored world where there is only positivity and joy. This denial is dangerous because it represses feelings and traumas, which inevitably resurface with greater force. Deep self-knowledge. In authentic spirituality, the focus is on self-observation, introspection, and the continuous search for self-knowledge. The seeker understands that the journey is inward. In illusory spirituality, the focus is on the external, appearances, titles, symbols, and recognition. The gaze gets lost in the superficial, forgetting the essence. Seeking validation versus inner peace. Illusory spirituality often seeks external validation and recognition. The value lies in the image of being spiritual, rather than the actual process. Authenticity, however, doesn't need approval. It generates an inner peace and clarity that are perceived in the silence of the heart, even amid challenges. Does your spiritual practice bring you closer to the real world or further away from it? Do you live your spirituality from the inside out or from the outside in? The subtle signs of spirituality becoming a prison. Spirituality, which should be a path of expansion, can, without a person realizing it, become an invisible prison. This prison is not made of chains, but of internal patterns that limit awareness and growth. Identifying these subtle signs is the first step toward liberation. Warning signs. Attachment to rules and rituals. What should be a guide becomes a burden. People feel they need to meditate for a specific amount of time, pray a specific number of times, or follow dietary rules to prove their spirituality. Attachment to mechanical rituals replaces intention and intuition. Practice becomes an obligation, generating guilt if interrupted. Stagnation, disguised as progress. This is perhaps the most dangerous sign. The person continues in their spiritual rut but sees no real change in their life. Relationships remain toxic. Financial problems recur. Emotions remain repressed. The individual believes they are progressing, when in reality, they are just on a treadmill, running in place. Fear of questioning beliefs. When a seeker feels fear, guilt, or anxiety when challenging a teaching from their master or group, freedom has been lost. True spirituality encourages autonomy and reflection, while spiritual imprisonment demands blind obedience. This robs them of the ability to think and feel independently. Social isolation. The person distances themselves from the material world, believing they are purifying themselves. They avoid relationships, everyday problems, and responsibilities, as if the external world were an obstacle to their evolution. However, this escape is not growth, but a denial of reality. True spiritual growth occurs within life, not outside of it. Rigid identity. The individual begins to define themselves solely as a spiritual being. Spirituality becomes their sole identity, denying their human complexity. They forget that they are also a son, a friend, a professional, someone with hobbies and interests. Spirituality becomes a mask that, instead of revealing their authentic selves, hides them. Constant judgment. Those trapped in this dynamic tend to judge others as less evolved or awakened. This creates separation and fuels spiritual pride. This attitude closes the doors to learning and compassion. True spirituality invites unity, not judgment. Lack of joy and lightness. Spirituality should be a source of lightness and inspiration. When it becomes a prison, it generates heaviness, rigidity, and a sense of obligation. Practices become tiring, and the process loses its joy. It's like carrying a backpack full of rocks instead of using wings. Shadow denial. The person insists on being only light, ignoring their pain and weaknesses. This repression creates an internal accumulation of unprocessed emotions, which can explode into emotional and physical crises. True evolution includes both light and darkness. Search for perfection. The individual places excessive pressure on themselves to never make mistakes, believing that perfection is a sign of evolution. This pressure generates anxiety and frustration. Authentic spirituality doesn't require perfection, but awareness and honesty. Every mistake is a learning experience, not a failure. Which of these signs have you noticed in yourself or in your practice? What do you feel needs more lightness on your path? When the search for light creates shadow. The search for light is a noble journey, but it can become dangerous when, instead of illuminating, it creates shadow. This happens when the seeker rejects their most difficult parts, their pain, and their traumas in the name of spiritual purity. By denying their emotions, they create a space of repression that doesn't eliminate the shadow, but only strengthens it and pushes it into the unconscious. Shadow generation mechanisms. Emotional repression. A common example is the denial of anger. Many people believe that feeling angry is incompatible with spirituality. Instead of embracing and transforming this feeling, they try to suppress it. However, repressed anger builds up and manifests itself destructively in passive aggression, judgments, physical illness, or unexpected outbursts. The search for light in this case breeds more darkness. Illusion of spiritual perfectionism. The person believes they need to be impeccable to evolve. This constant effort to meet an unrealistic standard generates anxiety, harsh self-criticism, and burnout. Instead of walking lightly and naturally, they carry the weight of obligation. This shadow prevents the blossoming of consciousness. Harmful comparison. The search for light can also create harmful comparisons. The individual begins to measure their evolution against others, which generates feelings of inferiority or superiority. Both feelings feed the shadow ego and create an illusory competition. True spirituality is a unique and personal path. Shadow projection. When a person denies their own flaws, they intensely project them onto others. They can't see their own arrogance, but they see it in everyone around them. This generates constant conflict and impedes self-criticism and growth. Projection is an unconscious mechanism that keeps the shadow active. The search for light that creates shadow also reveals itself in the difficulty of asking for help. The person believes they must solve everything alone to prove their evolution. This attitude isolates them and prevents them from learning from the experience and support of others. Support, vulnerability, and exchange are essential parts of the spiritual process. Do you have fears, anger, or sadness that you pretend not to have in order to be more spiritual? At what cost do you seek the light? The trap of exaggerated positivism. Positive thinking is a powerful tool, but when used excessively, it becomes a trap, known as toxic positivity. Excessive optimism leads to a denial of reality and creates the illusion that everything is fine, even when it isn't. This attitude prevents true transformation because it fails to recognize the problems that need to be addressed. Excessive positivity doesn't heal pain, it only hides it. Many people believe that being spiritual means always being happy, joyful, and optimistic. This belief creates enormous internal pressure, as life, by nature, brings challenges. By repressing emotions like sadness, anger, or fear to maintain the image of being enlightened, a person disconnects from their own humanity. Spirituality loses its authenticity and becomes a theater, an exhausting performance. The big problem is that excessive positivity prevents us from embracing pain, and it is precisely through contact with pain that true growth occurs. When we deny difficult feelings, we fail to learn from them. Toxic positivity blocks self-knowledge, transforming spirituality into superficiality. Signs of excessive positivity. Guilt for negative feelings. When someone believes they must always be positive, any negative emotion is seen as a personal failure. The person blames themselves for failing to maintain a high standard. This guilt creates a vicious cycle of repression and frustration. Lack of compassion. People who believe everything should be positive tend to judge others for their struggles, repeating cliches like, "Just think positive." This attitude invalidates others' pain and creates barriers in relationships as it denies the complexity of others' experiences. Difficulty dealing with reality. Life requires courage to face challenges, not just optimistic phrases. Excessive positivity prevents people from developing resilience as they don't learn to deal with problems in a healthy way. True spiritual strength lies in weathering the storm, not in pretending the sky is always blue. Fear of the law of attraction. While the law of attraction has its value, interpreting it in extreme ways generates fear. The person begins to monitor every thought, believing that any negativity will bring disaster. This anxiety is the opposite of the peace that spirituality should offer. Genuine insulation. Deep relationships are built on sharing joys and pains. When someone pretends to always be okay, it creates an emotional barrier. This leads to isolation, as no one truly connects behind a mask. Do you feel comfortable expressing your sadness and fears? Does your spirituality teach you how to cope with pain or how to run away from it? Spirituality as an escape from reality. Spirituality should be a path of integration between the inner and outer world, but it's often used as an escape from reality. This happens when spiritual practices are used to avoid responsibilities, pain, conflicts, and everyday challenges. Instead of promoting growth, they become an illusory refuge. The person believes they're evolving, but in reality, they're disconnecting from life. Examples of spiritual escape: meditation as escape. Meditation is a powerful tool for self-awareness, but it can become an escape when used solely to forget problems. The individual takes refuge in inner silence without applying their learnings to daily life. They feel at peace in meditation, but continue to fight with family and procrastinate at work. Addiction to mystical experiences. The constant pursuit of altered states of consciousness or mystical experiences becomes a way to avoid the tedious and mundane. The person lives in search of transcendence but neglects relationships, work, and health. This dissociation between spirit and matter creates a profound imbalance. Ritual dependence. The person becomes hostage to rituals, feeling they can only function if they fulfill them. This dependence creates anxiety and attachment. Spirituality loses its lightness and becomes a burdensome obligation, serving to give a false sense of control over life. Refusal to face difficult emotions. The person uses spiritual phrases like, "Everything is fine," or "just gratitude" to avoid dealing with pain, grief, or fear. This attitude impedes emotional growth since suffering, when denied, doesn't disappear. It's just pushed into the unconscious. Social isolation. The person believes they need to distance themselves from the material world to maintain their pure energy. While moments of seclusion are important, Living permanently isolated is an escape, not a means of evolution. Human beings grow through contact with others and the challenges of the world. Passivity and lack of action. The person believes that everything will come from the universe without personal effort. This passivity breeds stagnation and frustration. The authentic spiritual path unites faith and action. If these words have brought you back to silence, consider joining our community. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thus, each new encounter comes as a gentle reminder to regulate the body on the path to integration. We continue to fine-tune our presence, one calm step at a time. Does your spiritual practice give you the energy to deal with real life, or does it help you escape it? Where do you notice the most disconnect between your pursuit and your daily life? The spiritual ego. When the I disguises itself as a master. The spiritual ego is one of the most subtle and dangerous traps, because it cloaks itself in light to camouflage itself. It arises when the desire to evolve is hijacked by the need to stand out and feel superior. The person believes they are on the path to enlightenment, but in reality, they are constructing a new identity based on vanity, pride, and superiority. Manifestations of the spiritual ego. Need to prove evolution. The spiritual ego needs external validation. The person displays their practices, shares mystical experiences, and seeks constant recognition, transforming spirituality into a spectacle. Comparison and judgment. The ego is strengthened by feeling more enlightened than others, creating the illusion of a spiritual ranking. This attitude breeds judgment and separation, the opposite of compassion and unity. False master position. A person who falls into this trap may assume the role of master unpreparedly, offering advice and dictating rules to boost their own self-esteem. This can result in manipulation and misdirection of other seekers. Inability to recognize errors. The spiritual ego doesn't admit to failure, as this would threaten its image of perfection. This attitude impedes learning and creates a facade of virtue that doesn't correspond to inner reality. Difficulty receiving criticism. Any questioning is seen as an attack on the constructed spiritual identity. This creates rigidity and impedes growth. The true seeker, on the contrary, remains open and humble in the face of criticism. Insulation. The person believes that few are at their level and distances themselves from others, nurturing the feeling of being special. But true spirituality brings together, not separates. Do you talk about your spirituality to connect or to impress? What do you do when someone criticizes your beliefs? Comparison on the spiritual path and its risks. Comparison is a silent trap that can sabotage spiritual growth. It arises when seekers measure their evolution based on the journeys of others, turning spirituality into a competition. The dangers of comparison, anxiety, and frustration. The belief that there is a spiritual finish line generates anxiety. People feel behind and frustrated when they see others' progress. The truth is that every journey is unique. Ego feeding. When someone feels more awake than others, their ego inflates, generating spiritual pride. Humility is the antidote to this trap. Feeling of inadequacy. Comparison can create feelings of inferiority, leading to giving up. People forget that their journey has its own value. Distorted vision. The digital world only shows us the best moments of other people's journeys, creating illusions about their progress and fueling insecurity. Loss of authenticity. By trying to imitate others, one disconnects from one's own essence. Spirituality only flourishes in authenticity, not in imitation. Do you compare yourself to other people's spiritual journeys? Do you remember that your path is unique and perfect for you? Dependence on masters, gurus, or spiritual groups. A master's guidance can be valuable, but when it turns into dependence, it becomes a dangerous trap. The seeker believes they will only evolve if they are tied to a person or group, losing their autonomy and creating a cycle of submission. Signs of dependence. Inability to make decisions. The person feels insecure about their own intuition and outsources their decisions to the teacher. A true teacher teaches how to stand on one's own 2 feet. Idealization and fear. The seeker places the guru on a pedestal, believing him to be perfect, which opens the door to manipulation. He is afraid to leave the group for fear of being lost. Exclusivity and sectarianism. The person begins to believe that only that group possesses the truth, which generates intolerance and rigidity. Loss of authenticity. The seeker repeats words and beliefs without reflection, embodying a collective identity instead of developing his own essence. Emotional weakness. Dependence weakens personal responsibility, as the person expects ready-made answers instead of looking within. Do you feel free to question teachings and change your path? What would you do if you had to make a major spiritual decision alone? Spiritual practices that can become addictions. Spiritual practices are tools, but when used compulsively, they can become addictions, generating anxiety and rigidity. What should bring freedom becomes a new kind of prison. From habit to addiction. Compulsive meditation, used only as an escape to avoid pain or reality. Mechanical repetition. The use of mantras or prayers becomes a mechanism of emotional control, devoid of meaning and intention. Therapy dependence. The constant search for healing sessions without integrating the learnings into real life. Information addiction. The consumption of books and spiritual content without actual practice, generating an accumulation of knowledge but little wisdom. Do you feel like you need to practice to be well? Is your discipline a conscious choice or an anxiety-producing obligation? The judgment of the less awakened. One of the most common pitfalls of toxic spirituality is judgment of others. In this pattern, the person believes they are on a higher level and looks down on those less awakened with disdain. What should be compassion turns into spiritual arrogance, fueling the ego and separation. Consequences of the trial, distance, and isolation. The person distances themselves from family and friends, believing they don't understand their path. This breaks bonds and creates loneliness. Loss of humility. Judgment strengthens pride, closing a person off from learning and unity. Lack of empathy. The inability to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand that each journey is unique. Energy waste. The energy spent judging others is energy that could be used for one's own evolution. Have you ever felt superior to someone because of your spiritual journey? Do you truly practice compassion in all your relationships? Delving deeper into each of these topics could be the turning point you need. And now, I want to hear from you. Which of these points did you most identify with? Sharing your experience not only helps you organize your own thoughts, but also enriches everyone's journey. If this crossing brought you peace and quiet, consider sticking around. Thus, each new video arrives as a calm invitation to delve deeper without constraints. At the next meeting, we will open the 2 tests that reveal anyone's character. You will see how to stop being fooled. 2 simple signs that reveal who someone is. If it makes sense, come with me. The journey continues smoothly and becomes clearer.